Hello everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day and welcome to the Evans Gambit series, the new series I'm starting where I'm going to cover every line in the Evans Gambit, accepted, decline, main line and every other variations that Black has. This series will be divided into few parts. This is the part number 1 where I'm going to cover all the accepted variation of this gambit. So why Evans Gambit? First of all, Evans Gambit is a true gambit. Unlike Queen's Gambit, in Evans Gambit, you are basically never be able to recover the pawn. And who this opening is for? Well, the player who are seeking to have a initiative and they are not materialistic. They can give up a pawn or two to keep the initiative going. They understands the value of initiative. They understands that the material approach is not always the right approach. Those players can play the Evans Gambit. So the Evans Gambit starts with pawn to e4 by white, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5. So we have the Italian game Giocopiano variation, and here comes the Evans Gambit with the signature move pawn to b4. I'm going to cover what if black play knight f6 here and some other variations as well. But today we are just going to focus on what will happen if black just accepts the gambit. Bishop takes b4. c3 is what white aims for. White's idea is white wants to play pawn to d4, and also this pawn gambit does open up the queen, does open up the bishop on this diagonal, and does give a support to d4. So it does a lot of things, just one move, and that's where our compensation lies. Now, here black can basically play bishop a5, c5, and e7, sometimes d6. In this video, I'm only going to cover bishop to a5. Bishop c5 and bishop e7 will be covered on a separate video. Okay, here basically two moves are possible. You can castle or you can strike with d4, and I'm going to suggest you to not waste any time, strike with d4 right away. Okay, now here there is a very main line with pawn to d6, which I'm going to cover on another video, and there's another line where black accepts the pawn. This is also a gambit as this pawn is pinned. So this is another main line. Here what I suggest you is, well, the main line goes with something like castles as white, but I'm going to suggest this new, but well, not very new, but a fresh idea which black may not be very well prepared against, queen to b3. So the idea is very clear. I'm attacking the pawn on f7, and you basically have two moves to defend it, queen to e7 and queen to f6. Now, queen to e7 makes more sense because you don't want your queen to be exposed with these e5 ideas. But still, queen f6 is one of the main lines. Nigel Short played this gambit in against Gary Kasparov once, and Gary won that game as black. It was a classical game, but because Nigel did not play the opening correctly, here Nigel castled. Gary played knight e7. Nigel here I think Nigel, oh sorry, Gary played bishop b6, and the game continues where Nigel did not play e5. Here let's say if you play knight to e7, we will go back to bishop to b6 in a moment. Here I suggest you to play c takes d4, simply capturing the pawn back. Now you have a very beautiful center right now, so black has to do something. Now if you capture the pawn on d4, then I recaptures, and after recapture I have bishop to b2, and that g7 pawn hangs, that f7 pawn hangs, and basically your entire position hangs. So let's say you castle, which is already a mistake. Here comes bishop to g5, queen to g6, and believe it or not, there is a very forced way to simplify the positions in white's favor. And if your opponent is engine precise, then only he can basically survive the position. Because here you can go for this tactical idea and queen a3 with a double attack. At this point, I found only two games on the database where both games continue with knight to c6, defending the knight, well, moving the knight and defending the bishop, which immediately loses to pawn to d5. And yeah, white won both games. But here, well, miraculously, there is pawn to d5, according to engines, where after pawn takes pawn, there is pawn to b5, and somehow black is saving both pieces. You can try to dig deep in this position on your own, but yeah, that if your opponent is engine, then it's fine if you just give them a draw, right? And still white is tiny bit better somehow. But this is if you play a engine precise game. So that's what happened when you play knight to e7. White just takes the pawn and you are busted. Human play. If you play bishop to b6, that is one of the main lines, then I suggest you that you have already castled. Now e5 is a very strong move. Attacking the queen, and definitely you cannot capture the pawn because a knight captures, queen captures, and well, there is an open file on the, let's say you play knight captures, queen captures, and let's say bishop to a3. With some ideas, I'm gonna capture, play knight c3, rook to e1. There are a lot of ideas in the position, and that pawn is plainly hanging on f7. You could have captured on the last move as well. So this is just bad. That is something to be well, something you should notice, that in Evans Gambit, basically black will never be willingly open the center. So queen to g6 makes most sense, and this is the most played move in this position. Here I will suggest you to just capture the pawn back. Say takes d4. Now white has a very solid center, and for a price of one pawn, you can already see that white has castle king, open bishop queen, and dark bishop is the soul of our position as well. Can go to a3 and harass black pieces further. The main compensation lies with this bishop. This is a problem piece in Evans Gambit for black side, and it always remains a problem piece. And with this pawn on d6 and this bishop on b6, it is even more harder to develop this bishop. So that's a long-term compensation for white. A sample line can go like, let's say you play knight takes d4. There was knight a5 as well. I'm going to cover that as well. Here you just capture, and after capture you play knight c3. Now the simple idea might be to play knight b5 or knight d5. And let's say you try to develop knight to e7. I'm just going to stop you from castling by playing bishop to a3. And I mean, humanly speaking, you are busted as black. And a single mistake in this position will cost you the entire game directly. For example, you may think that bishop takes e7 is a direct threat and I have to respond to it. But believe it or not, in this position, the only move that black has to survive is pawn to b6. Somehow a good move, because after I take on e7 and let's play rook to d1, white has more than enough compensation for 2 pawns. This king is not going to survive for long. But according to engines, black is kind of surviving, even though white is still better in this position. This is by the best play. And if you play, let's say, a natural move, let's say knight c6, then first of all, you are never castling. And secondly, I can directly go knight b5, attacking the bishop and the pawn on c7. So you have to play bishop to d6, b6, and pretty much any move you play here wins, because I mean any move to rook to e1 is win. Rook to e1 is more precise, because then you will have no counterplay against that f2 pawn, because this rook is left here to defend it. This is also something to keep note on, because as Evans Gambit player, sometimes you actually leave the rook on f1 and rather want the a1 rook to come to e1, because you have the idea of this f4, f5 in future as well. Okay, here you are just busted. I mean, even if you try a6 or something, there is knight d6 check, and that's it. Pawn takes, and then the bishop on b6 hangs, the bishop on c8 never coming back. That is just how this position can collapse. One of the variations. This just goes on to show the true idea of Evans Gambit, the true Gambit idea. Just the king and the c8 bishop. That's it. Okay. So this gives us a good idea of what you can play against queen f6. Let's see what black has if white has if black plays queen to e7. Now this is one of the main lines. Here I suggest you just castles because the pawn on e4 was hanging with check anyways. And here there are basically two moves that has ever been played. Bishop to b6 and there is knight to f6. Now I'm going to cover bishop to b6 exclusively, but I'm going to show you one very small sample line, what will happen after knight f6. The line against knight to f6 is you just capture the pawn on d4, and if black has to show something for this piece placement, this horrible piece placement, e5 is coming in, you have to capture the pawn on e4. Basically it's forced, and there you go, bishop to a3. One game was continued with knight to d6, where, well, you could take on d6 and have a last long positional advantage, but here white just decided to play knight c3. Knight d5 being a decisive threat, so bishop takes e3 is forced, queen takes e3. You cannot capture the bishop already, and here black castle. This is the game we are following. Northerbek Abu Satarov played this in 2021, and his 2200 opponent, well, collapsed very fast. White played d5. Your knight is basically trapped, so black played b5. The game concluded quickly after rook to e1, queen to d8, and this beautiful move, bishop to b2, when the only move you have to defend the mate is basically more or less queen f6. And here comes queen c1, another beautiful move. And after queen h6, we even have the exchange of queens because this bishop is a true dragon. And here white simply played, well, a lot of moves are possible in this position. Well, you can try to find what's the best idea here. Well, your bishop is under attack on c4, so as the knight on c6. White simply took the pawn on b5. So if you take the bishop, then I take your knight on c6. Though black has this tactical idea with knight to b4, attacking the bishop, attacking the c2 square, and yes, you can play bishop to a4 and you're perfectly winning. Here white just finishes off in style with rook a to d1, hanging the bishop, but when the bishop is captured, rook to e4 is a game over. Well, the game continued few more moves, but it resulted in a beautiful checkmate. You can check it out by yourself. So this is what happens when black plays knight f6. You just capture on d4 and play bishop to a3 and you basically win. So after castles, bishop b6 now makes more sense. This is a recommended line by many players, but here I think white can simply play c takes d4. The two main variations in this position continues with either you capture the pawn on d4 or you play knight to a5, which is the main idea of moving the bishop to b6 anyways. So if you capture the pawn on d4, then, well, we capture. Let's first see what will happen if you play knight to a5. This is where the true gambit starts. Here I'm just gonna move my queen. It doesn't matter d3, c3, c2, a4, b5, it doesn't matter. Black will capture the bishop, queen will capture it back, and more than likely you cannot touch this pawn. This is a poisoned pawn. Bishop a3, knight c3, rook e1, and that's the game. So that you cannot touch. So let's say you play knight f6 because you have to develop pieces. You may play d6 because knight f6 runs directly into pawn to e5 and that is winning. So here you may play pawn to d6 before knight to f6. Um, Another very nice Evans Gambit move, a4. Always keep an eye on this bishop because it gets trapped when the a5 is here. And a4 is basically a free tempo gaining move. Now, let's say you play a6. You could play c6 also. Let's say then I play knight c3. Knight d5 is coming in. Knight f6 and e5. And you basically are busted. Pawn takes, bishop a3 and queen e6. Then I just play d5. And that's about it. Let's say you play queen g4, then another precise move would be to play. Just do not exchange the queens. You cannot castle short. If you try to castle long with bishop to d7, then knight takes e5. And you can see that black king is definitely got caught in the center. I have a lot of pressure here as white. This is as good as lost for black. So like let's say queen f4, then a5, and yeah, bishop d4, then queen b7. That's one of the lines. Just goes on to show that white does not have attack on the king side only. You can also attack the center, king side, queen side, wherever you want. That's the speciality of Evans Gambit. So after c takes d5, c takes d4, knight a5 just gives white a long lasting advantage because you are exchanging your basically the most active piece, and white has the center for just one pawn. We are not down two pawns either, it's just one pawn. Let's say black captures another pawn. Why not, right? Well, we simply capture it back, bishop takes, and we simply develops the knight. Now, the threat of knight to d4, knight to d5 is huge. Here, either you play c6 or you play knight to f6, which makes most sense in the position. And white's moves are simple. White always wants his bishop on a3, and you never want white to have this diagonal open, so you may play d6. And here, well, you don't have to rush in with knight b5 or knight d5. A simple move like rook a to d1 will do. Hitting the bishop. Let's say bishop takes c3. What else? If you move the bishop, then knight d5 makes a lot of sense. And also simple rook to e1 and e5 makes a lot of sense. For example, if you move the bishop, simply e5, I think is a game over. If you take, there is rook e1, and you can't really take this pawn because there is a pin. Another typical Evans Gambit move. So let's say you take on c3, queen takes c3, and most definitely you cannot capture this pawn because g7 hangs and your king is caught in the center again. And if you take with the queen, rook e1, pins the queen, wins the queen. So black, let's say castles. Question. Pause the video for 2 seconds and find which rook you want to put on e1 square. Okay. Well, congratulations if you were hearing me well, because this rook d to e1 is the best move. Why? Because this f pawn is rolling down and we want these rooks to support those pawns. And this rook is on d1 would be a tempo gainer for this bishop when the bishop g4 is played. Let's say when we play pawn to f4 or something. So we are just getting rid of that rook. So, well, killing two birds with a single arrow. Let's say black try to develop. There is very little black can do in this position. Well, you could not have moved this queen out. So e5 was the threat. We're going to execute e5. Okay, knight to e8. If you play bishop takes bishop first, then I capture the knight, of course, hitting the queen. So you play knight e8. And then we just go f4. Let's say the exchange happens. And believe it or not, here basically there is only one move that black can play, which gives black hope to survive, which I highly doubt against any human opponent. But the only move in this position is rook to c8. If your opponent play a simple and silly move like queen to e6, it loses the game on the spot. Here you simply retreat queen d3 and there is a double attack. There is no way to defend against pawn takes pawn, opening an attack on the queen, which would be defended by the bishop, and also the pawn to f5, which would attack the queen, pawn to f6, which would, well, destroy the king when the knight is just doing nothing. And here, after, let's say, well, if you play f5, I just take on d6. That's it. And there's nothing more you can do to stop pawn to f5. After queen e6 and queen d3, sorry, here after queen takes c4, let's say black play rook to c8, which is the best move. I'm going to show you a very nice and fine variation where I'm going to play all the best move from black side only, and all the best move from white side also, which is quite natural actually. Here we are going to play f5, of course. Nothing you can do to stop f6. Might as well play c5. That is the idea of rook to c8. Had you played c5 directly, I can capture this pawn and then capture this pawn, which will result in the rook on f8 being trapped. So let's say you play rook c8, f5, c5, f6, g6, e6 is just lost. So let's say you play queen to e6. Then I'm not going to exchange the queens, of course. Queen to c3, d5. We're trying to resolve the center in the center, position in the center. And believe it or not, this is basically a zigzag. Here you can simply play queen b3, hitting the pawn on b7, b6, queen d3, trying to provoke this pawn to come to d4. And once it does, well, you could have played something else as black, but this is the best one. Here you just simply played rook to e4, and you can already sense that something is going to happen. Rook g4 is coming in, queen g3 is coming in, rook g4, rook h4 is coming in, other rook to f4 is coming in. There is a lot of pressure in black's position, and well, there is a pin here also, so that also works. And this knight is, well, what I can say, it's a horrible piece, and it is working for white right now. So that is the, well, this is what, if your opponent plays the best moves possible in the position, then he gains this position, which I would say is humanly very pleasant for white, and white only. So yeah, have fun with this variation. The lines I showed you is all engine analyzed with Stockfish 17.1. I left the Stockfish on a depth of 45 to 50 to 55, sometimes even 60. So these are the future proof lines, and all these lines also have a human element to it. Sometimes I did not pick the top engine move because it was too inhuman. But these are good enough if you're facing a human opponent. So yeah, that is it for the part 1 of Evans Gambit. So I will see you on the next one. Till then, take care.